I have to admit, this next presentation is one of my favorites to give, though it may not be suitable for the squeamish, because this one is all about insects, the good, the bad, and the ugly that we might encounter in our gardens. We'll talk about how to identify many of these critters and what to do about them. And this is what I meant when I said not for the squeamish. If you just jump back from your computer screen, that's okay. And bonus points if you know what kind of insect this is. It's a grasshopper. All right, but first let's talk about some of the good guys in the garden. When we think about the world of insects, at least 90% or more of them are actually beneficial to us, and the few that cause pest problems are a very, very small percentage of the overall whole of the insect world. So here's a few that are very beneficial to us in different ways. So I'll give you a minute and see how many of these you can correctly identify. So have you thought about it? All right, so starting with the top left corner, that's maybe a giveaway. That is the lady beetle, or commonly referred to as the ladybug. This is a voracious predator feeding on aphids and other small-bodied insects in both its adult and its larval forms. So its larval form looks a little bit like a black alligator with orange stripes, but also very, very, if not more, voraciously eating aphids and other insects that we don't want. So moving clockwise from the lady beetle, we have the praying mantis. Now again, this is a well-known and very effective predator insect. And I just want to point out that they will eat bugs that we don't want in the garden, but they are not very discriminatory. They will eat just about any insect that they can come across, including others of their own kind. So when we say that these are good guys, we're really talking about what they do for us in the garden. We're not really making any moral judgments on these insects. So last one on the top row, if you guessed that that was a honeybee, then you were correct. We also have a lot of native bees in Idaho. So honeybees the European honeybee is an imported bee. It lives in colonies and is typically cultivated and kept and managed. But many of the native bees are going to be solitary bees, meaning they're going to create their own nests individually in different environments, sometimes even in the ground. And they live singly, not in colonies, but they are very important pollinators, and we need all of them around. All right, so the ones on the bottom row. So this little tiny guy on the bottom left, that is a parasitic wasp. Now you might think, what is this wasp doing? Is it large enough to eat that aphid? No, it actually is not. What it's doing is it's laying its eggs inside the aphid body. And its eggs hatch and its young feed on the aphid and destroy it. So pretty nasty stuff, but a very, very effective predator. The one in the bottom middle. If you said a bee, well, that's a really good guess because it certainly looks like a bee. But that is actually a syrphid fly, also known as a hoverfly or a flower fly. And these are both important predators and also great pollinators. So they do dual duty in the garden. And this little guy on the bottom right, this is a ground beetle. And often ground beetles are blamed for different kinds of root crop damage or lower leaf damage. But most of these guys are in the soil as a very, very important decomposer, breaking down materials, and just kind of they're the trash collectors of the garden. So if you uncover one of these in the mulch or while you're digging in the garden, just let it amble by and do its business and don't cause it any grief. So another really important group of arachnids to consider are the garden spiders. So not technically insects, and often quite feared because they are huge and can be kind of scary if you encounter them suddenly in the garden. But these are some really beneficial creatures, and it's important for us to keep them in our gardens and try to protect them. They're not poisonous or dangerous to us, and they are excellent, excellent hunters. So if it helps for you to think about them like the spider in Charlotte's Web, then that might help. But just give them a little room and let them keep eating all of the insects that they are eating. So those are some good ones. Let's talk about some of the bugs that we really love to hate. And topping that list is the squash bug. And the reason that we really don't like them is because of what they can do so quickly in the garden. They can really cause an entire squash plant to sort of deflate almost overnight. And if you have a lot of them and you have just a few squash plants, you usually are going to lose. So what can we do about squash bug? Well, here's a picture of what they look like. There's also a picture of the eggs. By the time you see the eggs, you're already halfway done losing the battle. Let me tell you a little bit about how squash bugs work. So they tend to overwinter in garden debris or brushy areas around the garden. Early in the summer, sometimes May, sometimes June, they will emerge from their winter area, and they will look for mates, and they will mate and lay eggs. So if you're out there early in the season and you have a watchful eye and you can catch and destroy those first adults as they're emerging, then they're not going to lay any eggs, and you're not going to have the same kind of problem you would have if you missed them. So if you don't catch those first emerging adults, next best thing is to seek and destroy the eggs. They tend to be laid in the very corners of the veins close to the stem. They're a shiny brown. You can scrape them off into a bucket of soapy water. You can sometimes even cut out the portion of leaf that has the eggs, and also be watching for the adults that are laying them. One thing you can do is put boards or rolled up newspapers or other things under the plants at night, and the insects tend to crawl in there while at night, and then you can dispose of them later. And if you are going to use some chemical controls, so whether it's an insecticide dust or something like a diatomaceous earth, you want to use that only very early in the season before the plants have flowered, because of most of those products, even the organic ones, are going to be toxic to bees. And so if the squash are flowering, they're attracting bees, and we don't want to attract the bees and then kill them. So using treatments only very early in the season, and that should help you get a jump start on the squash bug. Colorado potato beetle is another really unpleasant critter. It can completely defoliate a potato patch, especially its larvae shown here in the picture on the right. They just skeletonize an entire plant in a matter of days. So what do we do about these guys? Well, first we need to learn to identify them. So on the picture prior, I showed you an adult and some larvae. Here's a close-up of the eggs. You can see they're different from the eggs of a squash bug. They're also going to be laid on a potato or a tomato plant. And then here's the larval stage, and these are the ones that really do a lot of damage. So the earlier we can catch and kill them, the better. What do we do about them? So we want to clean up any of the nightshade or related weeds near your garden. So anything that might be an alternate host. If you can find adults and larvae and you have a small garden, this can be a pretty effective means of control. Just regularly visiting your plants, picking off and squishing or dropping the insects into a bucket of soapy water to kill them. If you do want to use some sort of chemical control, BT, or stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, is a natural bacteria, and you simply spray it on the leaves, and it acts as a stomach poison to the beetle, but it's completely harmless to us, and it's not going to hurt any other insects unless they're eating the leaves. And the reason I recommend this over anything else is that the Colorado potato beetle has been such a pest for so many years that it has developed resistance to many of our conventional pesticides, but BT seems to keep on working. All right, aphids. This is another pesty pest in the garden. There are several different kinds of aphids. One of the worst is the cabbage aphid, and that's shown here on the left on possibly a kale leaf. And that's because they mass together. They have a powdery coating that makes them really resistant to sprays, and they can just colonize a leaf, and it's almost impossible to wash them off and get rid of them. This middle picture may surprise you. Not all insects lay eggs directly. Some insects at different stages of life have eggs that hatch inside the body cavity, and they actually give live birth, and that is what aphids do in the heat of the season. That's why it seems like they're just reproducing so quickly. It's because they're just simply reproducing that fast. The kinds of damage that you might see from aphids would be twisting and curling of leaves. It might be some sticky honeydew residue that stays on the leaves. If you do find the twisting of the leaves combined with the stickiness, but no signs of aphids, then that probably means that you've had some beneficials move in, and it might not be worth your while to do any kind of treatment. Whitefly is another very small insect relative of the aphid, and it typically is something that you're bringing home from the greenhouse with you. So always inspect plants that you're purchasing before you bring them home and make sure that they don't have any whitefly on them. And so for controlling both aphids and whiteflies, a protective covering when the plants are young can be very, very effective. So some row covers or some of the things that we talked about in season extension, those are going to be very effective aphid controls. And aphids actually have a really hard time getting back on a plant if you spray them off with water. They are also very easy to damage their bodies, and so just a heavy stream of water, not enough to break the plant, but enough to dislodge the aphids and remove them, is going to give you a good method of control, actually. Some insecticidal soaps have a good effect, but they need to be applied directly to the aphids and typically reapplied frequently. Now, if you're thinking, well, gosh, there has to be some other kinds of sprays that I can use. Yes, there are going to be many sprays that are listed for aphids, but keep in mind that most of the contact insecticides, or the insecticides that kill just by contact, are going to destroy the beneficial predators as well. And like I showed you in that picture of the cabbage leaf or the kale leaf, the aphids can really protect themselves by hiding in the crevices and cracks. So what ends up happening is you might spray the other insects that were there to control them, the aphids get away, and then they continue to reproduce. So cutworm is a particularly nasty little guy. So this is a caterpillar, right? So it is the larval form of a moth. And what it does is it travels along the soil surface and just eats the plant right at the base. So you've spent all this energy and time growing up your seedlings, putting them out in the garden, and in one evening a cutworm can come through and just knock them down. This is something you might find while you're digging around in the garden, and this would be the pupa or the chrysalis of the cutworm, this brown capsule. Sometimes it's moving, it's a little bit creepy. If you do find those in the garden, get rid of them. Toss them in that bucket of water, throw them away. Another control for cutworm is to simply put a collar around your young and tender plants, and that can even be a tube of cardboard, or in this picture, a paper cup, anything that'll block the path of the cutworm. There are some nematodes, some beneficial nematodes that you can use. That's a biocontrol. Also, a little bit of tillage or fall tillage followed by letting birds or even backyard chickens poke around in the garden can gobble up those pupal cases, and that can be a big help too. So this is becoming a much more frequently encountered pest all around Idaho, and this is the beet and spinach leafminer. It's a little fly. There's its larvae on the left. They're very, very small, and they feed between the layers of the leaf. So you're probably not ever going to actually see any insect. You just see the damage, which at first sight might look like sunburn, or it might look like some sort of disease, but it's actually the feeding of this little tiny fly larva. Again, that row cover that we recommended that you use for season extension and frost protection, this is a really effective barrier against the fly. If the fly can't land on the leaves, it can't lay its eggs. Very, very good way to prevent it. If you don't have that, another technique can be to remove the leaves that you see start to become damaged. But remember, there are more where that came from, and they tend to have multiple generations per year. So also using less pesticide in the garden can encourage the natural enemies, which are after these guys. And some gardeners have had some luck using either spinosad or neem, N-E-E-M, as an organic control, but neither one are 100% effective. So really the best way to prevent them is through that row cover. So the imported cabbage worm, or the cabbage butterfly that we see fluttering around in our gardens, is another very common pest of our cabbages, broccolis, and other brassica cole crops. So you can see the little inchworm on the right. He's very small and green. He tends to blend in with whatever color of crop he's eating, but you can see that the damage is pretty extensive, and it can go deep into the head of that cabbage. It can damage all parts of the plant. So when you see these little butterflies, they're not just buzzing around and enjoying your garden, they're getting ready to lay these caterpillars. So last one I want to talk about is the earwig. So we tend to blame a lot of problems on earwigs. Earwigs really bother a lot of people. They really think they're a gross insect, and sometimes I agree, depending on where you find them. But just a few things to clear up. Earwigs will not travel into your ear. They are called earwigs because they're usually found in ears of corn. They also are actually an omnivore, and they can be a beneficial predator as well as a pest of some of our garden plants. So sometimes when we find them around our plants, they're actually doing good. But if the opportunity presents itself to nibble on a tasty, tender plant, they're going to take that opportunity. So if you would like to simply remove the earwigs and relocate them to another part of the yard, or just simply trap them and get rid of them, two really common and effective means are a rolled up newspaper or a small dish of maybe a little bit of vegetable oil and soy sauce, and the insects will fall in and not be able to get out. And in the case of the rolled up paper, they will hide in the folds. They really like tight closed spaces, and then you can just bang that roll of paper into a bucket and the adults will fall out. So those are some tips that you can use for controlling earwigs. I also think that diatomaceous earth sprinkled around the base of your plants will help as well, but you want to be careful not to use that around flowering plants. So there are lots of other insects that might affect your garden, but those are some of the ones that we see most of all and that are fairly easy to control as long as you're watching for them and you're prepared.